Well, hello and welcome once again to Tenses of Life here at the River Lodge in Reparoa, New Zealand with Dr. Chuck Missler and Brian Hughes. And we're just going to thank you to begin with for inviting us into your life, inviting us into your living room or space or wherever you might be watching this. And we were talking earlier today about what a wonderful blessing it is that people want to join us as we sit here and reminisce and talk about things past and present and future.
It's kind of a mystery. I mean, I'm just getting deluged with letters from people I don't know that are old friends. They know all they've tracked all the details, and I'm mystified by the intensity of their interest. But I'm flattered, of course. And it's nice to be able to respond. I haven't been able to keep up trying to personally respond to each letter. This is the best we can do is just come back this way, I think, yeah.
Well, and part of being together with them in this format, sitting together and talking about things, and you being willing to open up your life and share things that are important to you and have been special over the last decades, I think is much appreciated, and the letters reflect that, really.
They sure do. It mystifies me, but I appreciate them, yeah.
Yeah. We've been, in the previous times we've sat together here in the Tenses of Life, we've been over what in your book format outline you call the prequel. Your young years, your early teen years. Right. And, one of the highlights of that, clearly, as you've thought about it, is the two mentors who were primarily responsible for your love for the Word of God and your understanding of it.
William E. Biggs, he really invested in me we just developed a lot. He was like a big brother. We really did a lot of hobby things together, but he had a intrinsic passion for the Word, and that's contagious.
Yeah.
And and Ted Hacks. I had the benefit of a very unusual pastor. Ted Hacks was technically, I think you'd call him a Lutheran pastor, but he was really not really denominational. He just loved the Word. He had a passion for the Word itself. Went beyond any doctrinal boundaries, and that was also contagious. Those two really impacted my life in a way that I've never forgotten.
Well, and then we've talked a little bit about out of that grew your passion for the Word and your diligence in spending time in and with the Word, and how it became your primary hobby.
Yeah, I've always been very self-indulgent regarding hobbies. Photography and optics and all kinds of technical topics captured my attention, and I'd plunge into them, and I was able to, by a number of reasons, to really get into those hobbies. But of all those hobbies, the one that was the most dominant and most consistent all the way through, somewhere I just developed a deep love for the Word itself. Not as a religious thing, not as a ritualistic thing. No, it was just a fascinating area that was actually designed. Discovering those designs were a mystification. I just never outgrew that. And so as I lived through life, I always had a lot of hobbies. I was very self-indulgent in that regard. But my dominant hobby was just the Bible, for its own sake. I mean, it's hard to explain exactly. It wasn't from a religious kind of commitment. It was just, I just loved it. And I also recognized, I guess early, that you love your hobby more than you know your profession or your career.
Interesting.
It's just a reality that's hard to admit.
Yeah.
But it's very true that you just that's where your passion really is, and so that endured through all my crazy projects and adventures. The theme that's all the way through there is a commitment to the Word, and not in a religious thing, not as if I had some goal set up. I just did because it was what I most enjoyed doing. And it was, in fact, Hal Lindsey. I was going through a dark time at one time, and he sat down with me and says, "Chuck, what do you like doing most?" And he knew what the answer was. well, he knew that it was Bible study. He says, "It ever occurred to you to make your hobby your profession?" It never did. I mean, that was what I did for love. My profession had all kinds of commitments, but he was the one that really pinned that down, and he was probably the one that really nudged me, encouraged me to start thinking of myself as a Bible teacher. I never did. I just did it because I loved it, not because I was out with some goal, you know.
Right.
And so as I look back of all the people, I've had a lot of interesting people assist me, help me, and guide me. But it was really Hal that nurtured me into acting almost as the Lord's executive recruiter.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, you know, talking about your early influences to key people, key men that passed along their passion, and you caught it. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, mentioning Hal makes me think of Walter. Uh-huh. Walter Martin and Chuck Smith,
sure.
And the way that you guys came together every week. Pretty much, you were staying at Hal's house when you were doing after the Bible study, and the others you got up to mischief with, and it seems like you fed off each other, all of you.
Very much so. Oh yeah, absolutely. I've often felt that I had the benefit of being tutored by what I felt were the dominant personalities in the Christian community through those days. So yeah, absolutely. But there's another thing that we were talking about, things that were influential.
Yep.
There's another kind of thing that I was able to indulge in that's an unusual skill that I had the benefit of. It occurred to me as we were talking, I should probably bring this out as a possibility. There's a thing that we call an advice call.
An advice call.
An advice call. It's interesting. Probably all of us have somebody in our life on the horizon that are the major dominant leadership kinds of people that we don't know personally. But what's interesting, there's probably somebody you know in your family or nearby that does know them well. And I had the benefit more than once of taking advantage of that by someone that counseled me to do just that very thing.
To contact somebody else.
Yep, exactly.
And created the link for you.
And I had the opportunities to have what you'd call an advice call to Tex Thornton. Now back in those days, there was the legend in the management literature was Charles Bates Thornton, who was known as Tex Thornton. He's the guy that really invented the conglomerate, high technology conglomerate. He's the guy, the founder of Litton Industries. There was about 10 guys that left the Air Force as a team that were experts in statistical control. Henry Ford had just taken over the company and realized they were in real trouble, had no controls. So he got 10 of these guys to come as a team, and they saved the company, the Ford Motor,
Ford Motor
Company. And in fact, I think 7 of the 10 later became the top leadership. Bob McNamara, J. Edward Lundy, R.J. Miller. These guys, they were they then themselves became legends. One of them left Ford after about 3 years, that acquired a little company and grew a thing called Litton Industries. He's known as the founder of Litton Industries, and he himself became a legend as Litton Industries, which was the granddaddy large-scale technology conglomerate, and he invented that whole idea. Well, it turned out I had a mutual friend that knew him and was able to arrange for him to receive me for what's called an advice call. I actually spent, I look back, for me it was an incredible experience to be able to sit down with him personally for a better part of an hour, just what we would call an advice call. He's glad to do it, and the advice I got from that changed my life. And it often occurred to me that that's a technique that's available to any of us if we take the trouble. All of us know somebody that of that caliber that we'd like to aspire to spend some time with.
Right.
And so Tex Thornton actually spent an hour with me, and out of all of that, I got counsel I've never forgotten. It really changed my whole perspective. I was an aerospace kind of guy, and he was the one that, because the path I was on was one that he could see the parallels, because he himself spent time in Ford. Then he used aircraft, and he created the high technology conglomerate out of that experience base. And he was the one that pointed out to me that I really needed to separate myself from my aerospace background, which is a narrow thing, to get some Fortune 500 management experience. Not too much. Go there for 5 years, no more, but you need that to round you, to really get a generalist, thing. Well, it turned out,
knowledge base or whatever.
Exactly. And it was about that time that the Ford Motor Company was getting Lee Iacocca and a guy by the name of Harley Coppers, was one of their flamboyant executives. They were concerned about their lack of management depth. In General Motors, when there was an opening, which of 14 qualified guys would get the job? When Ford had an opening, the question, they were just too thin, they felt. So Lee Iacocca, they really had a passion to do something about deepening their management strength. And what Lee Iacocca came up with, he wanted to find a guy that's a generalist from a technology that's non-automotive to be the kind of guy they wanted to bring into their management team. And from that specification, someone remembered me from a previous employment at TRW years before. That's how Ford Motor Company came to approach me to come to Ford. And I had no real interest, because I didn't want to go to Michigan. I was a California guy.
Yeah.
And I wasn't one of these guys that really had a big car interest. That wasn't my cut. But that was just the point, because I was in the perfect mindset to be spoiled rotten. They really made me offer I couldn't refuse. And it was through an advice call that caused me to recognize the value of that call, which I ultimately went to Ford for 5 years. And it was a huge experience for me to actually be in a private salary role in a company like the Ford Motor Company, which wasn't in my career plan, but it was actually the missing link to really broaden my own personal profile and fulfillment and the rest of it. And I've often thought that's a technique most of us wouldn't think of. We have to be taught the idea of engineering an advice call with the right kind of guy for whatever your situation is a powerful tool, because they're typically willing, under the right circumstances, to spend an hour with some
young up-and-comer or somebody who's interested enough to call them.
But what an impact that has to really get a one-on-one relevant assessment and suggested direction. And there's been more than one of those in my history, but that was the major one. I remember when I had the chance to sit down with Tex Norton himself for an hour. That was a big deal. It occurred to me that's something that we don't normally, highlight as a career planning tool.
Right.
And yet it's far more powerful than the usual stuff you get, I'm prattling. I'll let you.
No, it's interesting. I'm curious concerning Ford Motor Company and when they came to get you and you, eventually accepted. What level of management was that?
I was in a private salary role. I was at the.
You were at the top end.
Yeah, and they really almost created the job to meet their need as they saw it, and it was a phenomenal experience.
And through that, other doors opened later because of that experience.
Yeah, and well, if I can reconstruct all those circumstances, but again, that was, and I did exactly what they recommended I do. I was there 5 years.
Right.
And they warned me originally, don't stay longer than that. I think I stayed about 6, but still, basically 5 years.
Don't get stuck there.
Yeah, and boy, I can see if I can reconstruct all the circumstances caused me to. Oh, I remember I had gotten in Ford in a situation where I could tell they were making commitments on the presumption I was going to stay, and I had made my mind that I was going to leave Ford to start my own company. But it happened at one one of the top executives, lives down the street from me. And on the weekend, I went down. I felt I had to tell them that I was planning to leave because they were making commitments that would have been awkward if I wasn't staying.
Right.
So I felt an obligation to tell them early. It wasn't a good time for me, but I should give them a warning that I was planning to leave. And so I went down that weekend and tipped them off. And I remember that I remember that Monday morning, I go to my usual office, and Priscilla Farr, my secretary, came into the office and says, R.J. Miller wants to see you in the 14th floor of the Glass House, which nearby is the building, corporate headquarters for a motor company. And it was nearby. And anyway, R.J. Miller was in those days the president of Ford Motor Company. He wanted me to see it. And I'm nervous because I figure I'm going to get my butt chewed here for ingratitude or whatever. But so go up there, go up to the 14th floor. I'll never forget that. As I walk into his office, huge office, he rises at his desk. Chuck Missler, I hear you're going to leave and start a company. And I'm expecting a Dutch uncle.
Yeah.
And he said, why didn't you let me know? I would have liked to be one of your investors. And I didn't expect that reaction.
Yeah.
Well, then I find out he's also leaving. Because he hadn't announced yet, but he let me in on, he was leaving presidency of the Ford Motor Company to become the dean of the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. And by the irony of later on, it turned out he was a neighbor down the street. But it was an interesting experience to get that absolute opposite reaction from what I was expecting.
Yeah.
And because you never know, there's changes going on all around, you know.
Shock, just a pleasant shock.
And that's probably one of the most powerful things that can happen is to maintain those contacts. Because suddenly you've got very close contacts in all kinds of other high positions that are part of a network.
Right.
And as I reflect back on my subsequent corporate life as a professional director, most of the boards that I was invited to join were boards that were run by guys that I used to know previously at Ford, at Philco, or whatever. And out of that, I really got into a whole different corporate mode of being a professional director, sitting on several boards. And I always used to be amused because they really I should have charged them tuition rather than bill them a fee, because each one is a learning experience, you know. And so, I could go on with anecdotes about those, but it's interesting as I think back.
Well,
the labyrinth that you take advantage of, if you aware and just do it, are the contacts you make. As not only you're growing, but they are too. So this contact base you have is growing like a network.
Again, you're feeding each other.
Yes.
You're forming associations that then are mutually beneficial through life, basically.
Sure, yeah, exactly. And you're constantly getting a call from someone that would like you to come and join their board for whatever, and you evaluate it and consider it. But it's part of the part of the thing that you don't career plan in the usual sense. It happens, but it happens through diligence of a different kind.
You're kind of building a house. It's a house of a lifetime
career
deal.
Actually, yeah.
Kind of piece by piece.
A lot of assumptions are built in this, assuming that you're looking for a general management, long-term, kind of perspective. Yeah.
And that kind of feeds into what we talked about last time we were together on Tenses of Life. I believe that you were talking about taking advantage of opportunities that present themselves. The Lord makes an opportunity, but it's up to you to take the opportunity.
Yeah, I look back and try to figure out. The one thing that seemed to characterize my life is I didn't hesitate to take advantage of an opportunity.
Yeah.
I was opportunity hungry. I was willing to jump in and try. And I guess part of that because I didn't have any insecurities particularly, and because of that, because I had a wife that was willing to tag along on all these crazy ventures.
Good point, because for everyone who's married, the decisions we as men make affect our wives and our entire family and their future as well.
Oh yeah, well my problem when people say to you, Chuck, you have any regrets? I have one. As I look back, I have one major regret, and I didn't take better care of her. I didn't abuse her, but I presumed upon her. And
when you say presumed upon her, do you mean in a take her for granted kind of a way?
Yeah, exactly. And if I had my life to live over again, that would be the one thing that I would try to repair, my perspective, is to take better care of my bride. Because I just presumed and charged on, and she'd tag along and be a good sport. And but as I look back and evaluate, I realize I didn't abuse her in an abusive sense, other than I didn't take good care of her. And
so,
that's my main regret.
Well, thinking about that whole dynamic, as it relates to Nan, but in life in general, your whole life, and we're going to talk more and more about that as the weeks and months and years go by, as the Lord, grants us life here. If an older Chuck could give advice to a younger Chuck concerning that issue, which is your one regret, or anything.
Well, the first thing is the number one choice: make sure you get the right girl.
Yeah.
And then with the right girl,
important.
take care of her.
Right.
Reinvest in that. And I didn't do that. I just took her. I didn't abuse her, except to the extent that I just took advantage, presumed up her tagging along, and she did.
Yeah.
And we went from one crazy adventure to another, partly enabled by her willing to tag along. And never, that I can recall, was there any hesitation. She was game for whatever was coming, fortunately.
Yeah.
And we had an incredible, between Ford and Rockwell and the various boards I was on.
With you saying that about her being adventurous and willing, it took me back to the hallway meeting between you and your radio executive, and when you announced that you were a ham, and
the Collins acquisition.
The Collins acquisition story just goes with this so well.
Oh, that was an interesting experience from several points of view. I had been asked by one of my sponsors was the Rockwell people. They asked me to swing by and evaluate this document, which I looked at, and the question they asked me is, they didn't ask me to evaluate it in the usual sense, and what would we do if we had it? And so what the document described, Art Collins had built his dream system. He called the C system. It was a overly engineered super communications approach of things. And the question they asked, what would you do with it? And looking it over, I came up with a number of reasons why, the positives of it. It was a highly super reliable form of communication. And so what would you do with that? Well, you think of its possible application in a computer utility, which was just an emergent thing in those days. But the point was, I show up on a Saturday briefing to give my little report to the group of executives I was servicing. And as the meeting's breaking up, the top Rockwell guy, Don Beal, a guy I used to know from my old Ford days. Anyway, he said, "Hey, I understand you're going to Dallas with us tomorrow over the weekend." The key point was I didn't know I was going. That was sort of a surprise he was springing on me as this, you're going to tag along with us tomorrow when we all go to Richardson, but anyway, Dallas visit. And I was pleased to tag along because that was a privilege. In fact, I still have vivid memories. As we landed in Dallas and we're getting off the plane, as I come down the thing, the head of the McKinsey, the McKinsey consulting group, or the premier consulting group, the head of that was a guy, Bob Mattia. He buttonholed me as I come off the thing. "Chuck Missler, how did you get on this plane?" And I didn't know I was surprised to be on that plane too. But he's there flabbergasted because he's almost upset. He says, "I've been working on this deal for 2 years. And now that we're getting to the closing, how the hell did you get involved in the final thing? And I didn't have an answer. I didn't know either, you know, but he was really bristled about that. But the key point was, it was a surprise to me too, okay? So we go into, we arrive that night, Sunday night, for a Monday due diligence where everybody gets assigned a running mate and you go through the organization. And that was what was part of the program. And I'm going down the hallway, and one of the Rockwell guys comes to me and says, "Chuck, cool it, because Art Collins is madder than hell that you're on this trip." And I'm bewildered by this because I didn't know how could he wouldn't know me from Adam. What's going on? Later on, I was able to unravel what was really going on. The previous week, the TRW came in to look at Art Collins is sort of in play as a possibility, and the TRW people brought their computer consultant, which was a typical IBM-oriented kind of guy that offended everybody, it turned out, and they actually physically threw them out of the program because they're so mad that they brought this. And all Art Collins heard is that Rockwell now had brought their computer consultant.
Which was you.
Right. So this guy says, "Cool it, because Art Collins is madder than hell that you're," not me personally, he didn't know.
Yeah.
But that was
a computer person was on the premises.
I later on was able to sort what was going on.
Yeah.
So it was literally moments later, I'm going around the corner, and they had brought in sack lunches for the intermediate meetings going on. And that's when I get introduced to Art Collins. Okay, so here is this big, tall, lanky guy that's a legend. Anyone in communications knows the Collins name for a lot of reasons. So as he stands up, I sincerely, candidly just grab his hand. Art Collins, this is an event in my life. Because I'm a radio ham. Willie Six-Owned Hound Dog. We've all lived in the aura of the Collins 75A1, which is the Cadillac ham rig that's a legend among radio amateurs. Well, immediately, see, in his mind, see, in those days, you were either a computer guy or a communications guy, okay? Well, the minute I said I was a radio ham, I laughed because I can remember that so vividly, that I was suddenly a communications guy, not a computer guy. He put his arm on my shoulder, he's taller than I am, put his arm on my shoulders, and we walked down the hall, and he's all excited telling me about his new digital tuning thing, whatever. Well, what I find out later is the way that got repeated back to El Segundo, the capital, which was operating as a headquarters for Rockwell in those days, was that Chuck Missler's "I charmed the pants off Art Collins," which saved the merger. Now, that was an exaggeration.
So you're the hero.
That was the exaggeration, but it taught me a lesson. I mean, the way these stories start as an incident, they get exaggerated by the time they get repeated at headquarters. It creates a legend that isn't true, but it doesn't matter because that's the perception.
And you're never going to change it no matter what you say. So.
And but I've never forgotten that. There's been a couple of those kinds of incidents occurs. That's perhaps the dramatic one. Because I remember I was when I met with Wally Booth later that week, and he's the one that said, "I understand you charmed the pants off Art Collins and saved the Collins merger." So I thought he was kidding. I thought he was being facetious during the lunch.
Right.
No, he was quite sincere. That was the way it was reported at headquarters. And it stunned me to realize what thin threads reputations are made upon, good or bad.
Yeah.
And it's a, but I remember that so vividly that.
Well, you know, just listening to the story, and obviously we've talked about this over the decades, more than once, many times even. Really, you see it as you didn't really do anything, and yet that incident did save or make the deal. So in reality, what happened did influence him to Rockwell through the simple history you had as a ham with a very early
Yeah,
handle.
well, that's part of what was working for me. I had a very broad bandwidth of interests. I was a radio ham when I was just a kid.
Yeah.
I flew airplanes with my Sunday school teacher once a week. I started looking at the things that I took routinely in my life. They spanned an unusual range of technical interests, and I often thought that bandwidth is probably the thing that made me different, so to speak. It's also probably the ingredient that makes my Bible studies unique.
I believe absolutely.
See, that's part of the.
So
I think there's a value in developing a personal bandwidth that doesn't become too narrow.
yeah.
Yeah, and
Which is going back to your advisor, that you made the call, he agreed to meet. Basically, that's what he said, don't get pigeonholed.
yeah, exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
you had already established a fairly broad bandwidth anyway from 9 with the
Yeah.
beginning ham, the
And
flying.
they weren't superficial, because being a radio ham was a non-trivial qualification.
Yeah.
And
Well, you had to work at it.
yeah, and it's a legal license. Willie Six Old Hound Dog is.
And you've still got that.
I should make sure it's still current. I think
You
it
should.
is.
You don't want to lose that one.
Yeah, it'll be in the call books.
Yeah.
And Willie Six Old Hound Dog. That's a.
When you're talking about the broadness of the bandwidth of Chuck Missler, the ultimate proof text is Cosmic Codes to me. I mean, the volume of the books of your life's Bible study work that's available pretty much to this day, some of which you probably wish wasn't, but it's all there. Cosmic Codes really is it's not concise in any form. It's amazing in its broadness, but it kind of brings together in one book.
Well, I put in the front end of it. I do a full tutorial on cryptography.
Yeah. There's another broad.
Most people writing about Bible codes don't know what they're talking about, because they have no background in cryptography, which is what it's all about, really, in a sense. And the other thing that's underexploited, even I don't think we've done a good job at it, is the fact that the Bible's been designed. That's a bizarre discovery, to realize that the Bible itself evidences a deliberate design. That's staggering in its implications when you think it through. And so, and we haven't really exploited those implications as we might. But and I guess that's the part of the biblical stories that fascinated me from the beginning, is that the Bible has been designed. That is, when you think that through, it's staggering in its implications. And so, and Cosmic Codes, when I put that together, I thought that may have been a big mistake in its design, but I really deliberately, up front, really developed, based from the basics, what cryptography really is, to get that all across. And that's probably the strength of that book, is that it starts from scratch, so to speak.
Yeah. I've told people for years that if they don't read those first 4 chapters or whatever it is, that give them an understanding, basic though it may be, of cryptology, then they're never going to understand the design of the book necessarily, or some of the things that follow in Cosmic Codes. And you recall that was something you had thought about doing anyway, but when another book came out on Bible codes, you felt obligated, because of your knowledge, to respond to that with the truth.
Oh yeah, very popular book.
Very popular. Michael Drosnin's
book,
Bible Codes.
Yeah, and
it didn't seem he had any understanding of
no, he didn't,
encryption.
and through no fault of his own, but it just was incomplete and lacked perspective, and misled so many people, really, as to what Bible codes, what they really are. Because the most interesting ones aren't the most. Everybody talks about the equidistant letter sequences, which is the worst of all the codes. I mean, it's the most incomplete, and it's one everybody writes about, but it's not the most powerful or interesting. But they miss the point because they don't know really that just a member of a larger family of alternatives that are also all there.
Right.
And so, anyway, yeah, that's
Well, I can't miss the opportunity, since we're sharing our conversation with others, to say once again that I think Bible code, the cosmic codes, is, if I was, to me, it's the best piece of work you've done.
Really? Okay.
In the sense that the structure, the order, and the presentation takes inconceivable ideas, quantum physics, particle physics, macro, micro, and it puts it in an understandable form to any man. You don't have to be a physicist. You don't have to be a mathematician. You don't have to be a biologist. And you can get a sense of God's design in all of these areas and how it's his thumbprint.
But it's such a big book, it's a little intimidating for people.
Well, you know, I read it the first time. I was determined and did read it in one setting, and I am always thankful for that, because that's where I saw the structure, and I believe God gave it to you. I mean, you're skillful, but that's almost supernatural in the way I believe it is, that it's structured. And I think that it undoes all the arguments that people that don't know science but use science as a tool against, or instrument against the Bible, or their excuse not to believe it, or whatever. It undoes, it does. There is no argument left after that book, because it comes from every direction, and it's accurate in your knowledge base, which is so broad across the spectrum of engineering, information sciences, science, biology, physics. It just undoes those arguments.
We really have underpromoted. We haven't really promoted that the way we should, probably. Yeah.
Not ever.
But be that as it may, yeah.
And you know, one of the most valuable parts of the book, and that from your lips over many years, and I agree, is the appendix. The appendix itself is a wealth of knowledge and explanation. And anyway,
I'm going to go back and look at it.
Well, there's so much there that even the author needs to check it out from time to time.
And that's one of the embarrassing things, to go back and, wow, did I write that?
Yeah. Well, you know, thinking about life experiences, you know, Ford Motor Company, Rockwell, and the Collins acquisition, you came across an opportunity where you picked up a company for almost, for nothing, actually. For nothing,
yeah. Well,
I'd love to have you tell that story.
Oh, the bank, you mean the residential industry? Yeah, of course, by then, see, many people, when a company's, let's back up a little tutorial here. When companies get into trouble, most banks have consultants they can bring in to try to repair it. And the banks will usually be the source of that, because they're anxious. The banks don't want to own the company. They don't want to own stock. They want it to get healthy. And they're terrified of owning anything, because that just invites lawsuits. And so, but many people, when they're in trouble, a company gets in trouble, go the other way around. When they try to restructure things, they try to take advantage of the banks, not realizing that their next deal will come from a bank. So they don't really play the game smartly in that regard. And when you have a normal company get in trouble, the first thing that banks do is they'll get the consultants to come in and restructure the balance sheet and get it out. Well, the problem is, with a high technology company, there is no balance sheet. The assets go home at 5 o'clock, or people, or they're technologies that aren't tangible assets. And so when you have a high technology company get in trouble, you can't fix it from the balance sheet. You got to do it from the operating statement. And most people don't know how to do that, is number one.
Well, it seems like you kind of pioneered that with the Resdo deal.
Well, it happened that I stumbled into a few that I repaired, Western Digital being the famous one of those. But the point is that because my approach was to get the thing healthy, and the banks thus would prosper from that, that also made me attractive to banks who then had high technology companies in trouble. So I had no shortage of opportunities by companies that were in trouble. Their banks would welcome me because they had the instinct that if I got into it, A, it would get fixed, and the banks wouldn't get burned.
They'd recover their.
And so I had several of those. Well, one of those, there was a company called Resil Industries. It had been in trouble, and the banks already had, from a previous restructuring, were sitting on over 51% of the stock. They didn't want 51% of the stock, and I knew that. And so it came up for discussion, and I said if I would be willing to get involved. I said, I'll get involved if you'll give me control. And the way I want control is I want 51% of the stock, and but I wasn't prepared to put real money into the thing. He says, I'll buy your 51% for a non-recourse note. I'll buy it on a note. I'll owe you what I owe you on a note that has no recourse. And what a non-recourse note, many of you don't realize what a non-recourse note is. And they gulped, strained, but accepted my proposal. And I remember the guy that was trying to buy that company got unglued when he later discovered that I had bought it
For nothing.
For 50 grand.
Yeah.
And the 50 grand was in the form of a non-recourse note. He literally became unglued. So yeah, that's how we got hold of Resil Industries, and often in a situation like that, when you walk into the situation with the credibility of the banks behind you, it's not hard to fix.
Yeah.
You fix it and start to get it healthy, and it starts to turn, and you do one or two of those in a row, they think you did it on purpose. So, yeah, Resil Industries was a strange one, actually, for a number of reasons.
Well, but it was innovative. It's one of those things that you did that hadn't been done before. Western Digital, you mentioned as one of the most famous of the turnarounds. You did something there that changed an industry. It changed the way that people looked at the, you know.
Yeah, we were in the business, presumably, of large-scale integrated circuits, LSI, large-scale integrated circuits. And the factory I inherited in the project was old technology, therefore it was not competitive. In that world, that world was looked at as one of two things. Either it was a commodity, a high volume commodity, which is capital intensive to get the high technology to get the cost down, or it's in custom, where you do something, you design a large scale integrated circuit for a particular customer. It turns out both of those are dangerous places. If you're in commodities, you're in a capital intensive world where it takes capital to get the technology sharp to get the cost down. Our costs are about 2 to 1 out of bed. It costs us twice what it should cost us to manufacture, so we couldn't compete there. On the other side of the coin, the temptation is to get into custom, where you design a circuit for a particular user. That turns out to be a surprisingly dangerous path to take, because more often it takes you about 18 months to really fully develop a large-scale integrated circuit. During those 18 months, the company that you may be working, it may have gone under, or the production they were hoping to do they don't need. So chasing custom turns out to be a high-risk path also, without a lot of payoff. So both of those were very, very frail enterprises. Well, one of the things I realized is, when I took over Western Digital, is that we were building disk controllers that cost us twice what they should have cost because they were not competitive in their technology. But it happened that because we knew a lot about disk control, the chips that we could sell for about $20, cost us $10 to make, we had margin in there. But I realized from that the way I looked at the project was that we were in the publishing business. Our margin came from the design of the manuscripts, not from the chips, so to speak. And so the fact that we had a printing press that was out of date didn't impact the fact that we had manuscripts that were marketable. So I saw us as a publisher, if you will, in that sense.
And that was, nobody had done that before.
Well, what I started to do then, I also found that there were other applications that I knew I could see were coming, that we could design to and find a market for, because we knew those applications well. It happened we knew a lot about disk control, and disk control specs were improving, and we knew what they were, and so we could anticipate that. So we came out with disk controller disk controller LSI that was effective. And I can remember vividly, Summers, what the guy's name was, he called me from Motorola when we announced our double density super latest thing. He called me on the phone and really upset because he felt that when he heard that we'd come out with a double density, whatever it was, he says, "Did you have a leak on the specs? Did you know that that was coming?" You know, yeah, and I says, "No," but we had no committees. Those are disk control. That's our world. We knew we were going to do it, and we also don't have simulators. We use the line itself to develop the thing anyway. Because he says he knew it would take him 6 months to come out with a disk that speed, and we were already out with it.
Yeah.
And it underscored several things, that sometimes your response, being able to respond quickly, is one of the most powerful tools you can have. But also the streamlining, but also what we ended up doing, in effect, we defined it there was the way the market was looked. There was commodities, which are cost intensive, and there were custom. There's a middle one, application specific. If you know an application well, you can design to that application. There's a middle ground that's neither extreme, and we really created what later started to be called the application specific marketplace. And so that was really what started to turn Western Digital around, because that's what we really did. Because we knew a lot about disk control, so we built a whole empire
And the
around
bank
it.
called you in on that one too.
Yeah.
They were Chapter 11 at the time?
Yep. Yeah, oh, yeah. And I also learned very early that a Chapter 11 is one of the most powerful corporate development tools around. There's only 2 times that a company is clean. It's when it's first formed, or when it comes out of a Chapter 11. A Chapter 11, if used properly, can be a very powerful corporate development tool. And so I learned, I used to use that as a focus, if you will. And but that developed the whole concept of having of redefining an area. There's an area in the marketplace that you can anticipate and design to. It doesn't have to be custom, and it doesn't have to be, So that was that became practice, obviously, later, but very emulated.
Looking at your life, and just from 9 years old, getting into radio hams to Western Digital, where you probably were 55 or 60 or something, or
I don't know.
There, but who knows? You had, throughout that time, from a very young age, the Bible as your hobby, which was really your passion.
Yeah, that was my primary.
And it occurs to me, thinking of the Western Digital days, that during that time, and pretty much throughout your career, you always were faithful. I'm thinking of the Western, back to Southern California time particularly. You were always diligent to make your Bible study, to be there for the people who were, coming to hear you teach the Bible at the time.
Yeah, because I used to maintain,
wherever you were in the world or the nation, you got back there.
Yeah, and I used to use Monday nights typically.
Yep.
Because I wouldn't typically travel. It was in the shadow of the weekend, so I could count on being around. But it was something I did because that was what I did for fun. It wasn't that it wasn't like it was a rigor that I had to meet too. I just did because that was set aside for me.
Yeah.
And I can remember when I was, see if I can reconstruct the context. I was in a company. I was a chief executive officer. Maybe it was Western Digital days. But I can remember they wanted me to, they were having a Bible study in the lunchroom
Of that
company. And I wasn't coming to that. And I deliberately didn't. And they were really upset with me. We couldn't understand, why, Chuck, why aren't you coming to our Bible study at the lunch? And I said, I can't, I'll destroy it. If the chief executive officer starts attending, it'll destroy your Bible study, because people, you with me?
People will come anyway. Yeah.
And I says, if you want to hear my Bible study, go to Calvary Chapel on Monday nights, and I'll be there teaching the Bible. But I'm not going to come down in your lunchroom and teach it there, because it'll destroy
The sincerity or the purity of it.
At first they didn't understand it, you know.
Yeah.
And but I made that sort of a personal rule.
Interesting.
And because chief executive can't be a non-chief executive in a deal like, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Strange days.
Tell me about the importance of your love for the Word of God from your entry into the military till through your time serving the country and out. The Bible must have been it's an important part of your life, but it must have been very helpful in some periods of that time.
Probably,
I don't know if you can even remember back.
I hadn't looked at it that way. It was really my hobby.
I hadn't thought of asking you the question before either.
No, but I hadn't looked at it that way, because it wasn't like it was a commitment of against some standard.
No.
It was just something. It was an indulgence I allowed myself when, if I could. That was my hobby.
Yeah.
And I treated it as a hobby. In fact, I've often since, looking back, the key thing is to make the Bible your hobby, because it changes everything. You don't do it because there's an agenda you're following or a program that you're following. No, you do it because it's fun. It's what you look forward to being free to spend some time on,
Yeah.
because it's your hobby. And it's not a question of diligence. That doesn't fit somehow. That makes it sound like it's a requirement. No, it's something. It's an indulgence.
A passion.
It's an indulgence you allow yourself. Yeah. And even at the Naval Academy, I remember I used to sometimes attend the pre-Reveille Bible studies. That was a little different because there was an opportunity because of the way they operated there and all that. But again, it was a hobby I just enjoyed. That's probably where I started getting some of those habits, I think.
Speaking of habits, you have been...
Oh, the other thing I did, I started collecting commentaries.
Right.
I really started to look back.
Way back then?
Way back, because some of the commentaries on my shelf are $3.50. I mean, they're big, thick books, but back then they were inexpensive.
Yeah.
And I started collecting commentaries, Bible commentaries.
Yeah.
And I didn't get involved or caught up in any of the denominational issues, really. That's what's so interesting to me as I reflect back on the influence of Theodore B. Hacks, because he was a classic Lutheran pastor, had a church, but somehow I never got indoctrinated or concerned about doctrine. He wasn't into that. He was in the Word. And somehow his style of approach and so forth, I didn't see it as that designed, But I look back and realize that he really had a passion for the Word itself.
So he wasn't pushing you to Lutheran tradition.
Not really.
He was getting you enthusiastic and interested in the Word of God.
Exactly, exactly. And so it's I came from, obviously I was a Lutheran background, but it wasn't doctrinally intensive. It was just a love for the Word. And
as you've read the Bible over the years, you've created for yourself little devices, I'm going to call them, probably not a real good term, a ribbon system when you were doing, you know.
Oh, well, I've gone through several different ones.
Well, yeah, I just thought you'd talk about those a little bit and how it keeps it fresh. And
the idea, it's sort of like a diet. You know, you don't eat all vegetables, or only you mix it around. And so for a while I used different colored ribbons, and I would try to move each ribbon one segment at a time, but in such a way that it would be a mix. You know, I would have because I used to get on these kicks sometimes, where I'd start memorizing verses, but that starts to parse your interests in too small a dices, if you will.
Yep.
So that works for a while, but you get tired of it. One of the most enduring things I had, I think, there were 7 of them, I think, some number of ribbons where I had a...
There were a bunch of them, I remember.
Yeah, but of each different style.
Poetry, history.
Yeah. And Old Testament, New Testament, that trying... The idea was to try to vary the menu, so I wasn't all just in a particular segment all the time. So.
Yeah.
And that was my way of trying to force myself to move around a little bit.
Yep.
But none of those...
Well, you do them for a time, and then you would find a new one.
Yeah, it just...
But, you know, I remember somebody close to you telling me that it was very difficult to argue with you because one of the things you like to do was go through the dictionary and just increase your vocabulary an interest.
Oh, no, I did for... Yeah, I was...
I'm trying to be gentle here.
Oh, well, I was on a vocabulary kick.
Yes.
For a while. I used to have these little 1x2 little cards, and I'd put the word, every time I came across a word I didn't know, I'd type the word on one side and the definition on the other. And I'd always carry a few of those with me, and I'd learn brings back a memory. I was in the Air Force. You stand watch, like in the Navy you have watches. Well, in the Air Force you also have what's the equivalent we would call in the Navy a watch, where you are from 5 to 5, 24-hour period, you're the base commander. They have a name for that, and I've forgotten now what it was. But you stand that duty. And I was on such a duty when they got a call, and you jump into the beach jump into the Jeep with the air police to respond to this because representing the base commander. And it was some gal, foreign wife, I think, of some guy over in officer's country, who's committed suicide, trying to commit suicide. And so I dash up there and go upstairs. Across the hall, there's 2 kids watching what's going on and across, she's sitting in the John, which is the way that, across the hall, not as a toilet, just as a seat, but she's sitting there, and her hands are in the wash station with blood. She's slit her wrists. And so I took off my tie to put a tourniquet around her hands, and she starts fighting with me. She's really upset that I'm interfering. What business is it of mine? And she's literally fighting with me as I'm trying to stop
Save
the blood.
her life.
Well, that finally stopped. Finally, the APs come up too, and they relieve me. They take over. But I'm puzzled. I'm a little upset because it's a stressful experience, to fight this going on. There was 19 minutes between the time that I was there and the medical people finally arrive. And I want to understand. The APs want to go back to the APs, and I don't want to go APs. I want to go back to headquarters and wake up the guy there. I want to find out why it took I'm laughing because I'm remembering this so clearly. Why it took 19 minutes for the medical people to get there after we were there. We were just the air police, you know, so to speak. And so I find out by waking up some guy and going through that the rules are that no one can go faster than the base speed limit. And the way it was around, that meant they had to go around the end of the runway, and so that 15 miles per hour was the maximum. And if a woman's involved, they have to have a WAF on board, and there's not one standing by. So when you add this all up, so I'm really pissed. So we sit down, and I write up my 24-hour report, and I'm just kind of teed about the whole thing. So I sit down and I really write a lengthy report of this whole fiasco, right? I remember all this, but for some reason, I was on a vocabulary kick, apparently, because one of the words that I was learning was egregious. Egregious means not characterized by competence. Well, I have to use that word, it turns out, because apparently my night report gets sent up to the general. I get a call that's what it was. Next morning, I'm just having a cup of coffee with my staff, and one of them suggested I really ought to let the colonel know what I did, and let him know that's coming. Smart I did, because I get a call from a general that's the head of the hospital part on the base. Madder than hell. He wants me to get over his office. He says, if you want me to get over your office, I work for Colonel Scholes. You call Colonel Scholes and I'll come over. I wouldn't respond to him. You changed me. And he couldn't believe that I was that, you know. And it turns out I discover, strangely enough, that almost everybody on the base had a grief over the base hospital. They all had their own stories of mistreatment and screw-ups. So I discover I'm the man of the hour. Everybody's thrilled that the general was really getting cooked. I think he actually got replaced for a lot of other reasons, I'm sure. But I again did a lot of introspection. If I was career and really cared, I wouldn't have had the guts to. But I knew I was leaving the service. Screw it.
That wasn't your career.
I just really laid it out. And because I did, I was the man of the...
Kind of like the Collins acquisition. By the time you got back, you were a hero, and
yep.
here you're...
If I had wanted to win, I couldn't have won better. But if you cared, you wouldn't have the guts to be that candid, you know.
Well, there's not a lot of people...
From that day on, every time I had the duty, I inspected the mess halls. I just went through the place. Became a terror.
You were having too much fun.
Yes. Well, I knew I was untouchable.
Yeah. So you've had a lot of variety in life because you've taken those opportunities. You know, even how you got into Annapolis was almost accidental.
Oh, yeah, it really was, because I graduated midterm, so I had 6 months before, from the time I graduated from school, before the fall. So I had a window of time there. Oh, I had apparently qualified. The Navy in those days had two programs. They had an NROTC, a reserve program, and they also had what they called the regular program. If you qualified for the regular program, you not only, they paid your tuition, and I had somehow qualified for that, so I knew in the fall I would be part of the Navy regular program, which was a big deal at those days. But I thought that started me thinking Navy, as long as, you know,
right. Because that
and I
opportunity was available.
Somehow, if I was reading something, it occurred to me, gee, if I'm going to fool around with the Navy, why not go to the Naval Academy? And so I wrote a letter, and it was to the wrong guy, and he politely.
A senator you go through, or a congressman?
Yeah, a representative, and
Yep.
and I called the paper, got the wrong rep. He pointed out, I'm not your representative, so and so is. But anyway, I get the right guy, and that caused me the opportunity to take an exam, just a written exam before you get the physical. And I somehow, after that, they got me. To make a long story short, a couple of letters. This would have been April, not September now. This is ahead of all that. I somehow qualified for the academy, the Naval Academy, and I don't know if it was because of one of the exams or what it was there, but I can remember telling my elder brother that I went over to his house and indicated I'd been thinking about that, and he quickly, to let me down, not get my hopes on something that wasn't possible, said, "No, Jack, you don't understand. I've qualified. I'm going." He couldn't believe it. It all just happened. And this was all a matter of months that were presumably
just
limbo.
Dead time, or yeah.
And so I had the academy appointment, and that changed everything. Suddenly the world was open, I had a very narrow view of everything. That suddenly changed my horizon, if you will. Yeah, the Naval Academy appointment was a big deal in terms of my psychology about life in general. Suddenly that was strange days. What was it, 52, 50? Lost track. I've lost track of the calendar.
Must have been 52 because you graduated 56, right?
Yeah.
And you were 4 years.
That figures out. That figures out right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Most of the people, or many of the people listening to this, won't have been born for another 20 or 30 years.
Well, yeah. But I guess the lessons I seem to have learned or stumbled into is to try anything. Don't be afraid to reach. It shocks me to discover how thin threads reputations are made. Things I got credit for were accidental. They weren't something I did, they just happened. And I'm sure there's negative equivalents the other way elsewhere, probably, that I'm not aware of. But there's such thin threads. We live on presumptions.
And I think with people in general, and you in particular, we're never aware of the influence we actually do have on other people in many cases. Sometimes we do, but that's the exception, not the rule. And we started talking about the letters that people send, and that are passionate and deep and serious to you, concerning how you've influenced your life, the Lord through you, if you will, because I know you don't like thinking it's you, but it is. You're the instrument anyway. And through your life, you have influenced people in so many different areas in so many different ways. And the Bible studies, the material and resources that are available through you from the Lord for people have definitely influenced. I'm thinking about, you've got a thought here, though.
I just had another, it reminded me of another incident. We're at the Naval Academy. Nan is with me. I have graduated. I'm now an officer in the Air Force. I have an Air Force uniform. But I discovered that my plebe, the guy that is now a first classman, was a plebe when I was there. He has my old dress whites. When I left the academy, I gave my uniform, my midshipman white shoulder pad,
Yep. Very sharp uniforms.
Yeah, and I gave that to who was my plebe, who is now a first classman. So I realized while we're in Annapolis that he has my old uniform. And I got on this kick. I thought what I'd like to do is take Nan to a formal hop dance at Dalkin Hall, which is the armory where they have the every weekend night. I want to take her not in my Air Force. I could have gone in my Air Force uniform, but I want to go as a midshipman. It's just a kick I was on. So I tell him what I want to do. So he slips to me in my old whites, and I try them on. They said I can get into them. And so I have these dress whites, and I'm on this kick. We are in a hotel. Midshipmen aren't supposed to be on the second floor or higher of Carvel Hall, but we were on the whatever. But Nan's in her formal, and I'm in the midshipman, a little nervous, because I'm posing to be a midshipman. That's probably breaking a law of some kind, okay? But I don't care. I just want to I'm on this kick. I want to take her to this. So that's my thought. So I get in. It's getting the night for the thing, so it's getting nighttime. So we slip out the back way down Carvel Hall onto the streets of Annapolis. And I'm in a midshipman's uniform, 4 years after the fact, okay? Weird experience, but it's so vivid to me. We're walking down the street under a street light. Coming the other way is another midshipman with his date coming the other way. And as we were about to cross near a street light, he throws a salute to me, which is not a surprise because there's a tradition that you always salute a dragging classmate. It's just a
courtesy.
Except he calls me by name. Good evening, Lieutenant Missler. I freeze. I says, how the hell did you recognize me? Because I'm really in disguise. This is 4 years later. How did he look through all that and realize that despite the uniform, that was me? And I hadn't seen him for 4 years because he was a plebe when I was a first classman, right?
Yeah.
So I'm stunned and nervous. Well, it turns out, he explains, he says, you probably don't remember. I was on extra duty squad. I came down in the wrong uniform. Instead of putting me on report, you allowed me to go back and switch to the right uniform and let me march without putting me on. It was a triple jeopardy kind of thing that I ignored.
Yep.
And let him, but from that little
He
gesture,
remembered you.
He remembered me by name 4 years later. Well, I mean, it stunned me. It just took it. My whole evening was nervousness. I didn't know what else was going to crawl out of the woodwork to maybe get me in serious trouble.
Yeah.
And nothing did happen. But I can remember when we were dancing in the hop that some guys from the company, that was different, they were from my own company, they would look and be a little puzzled, and the light they could figure out what I was doing.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a big deal, you know. But I remember that was such a disturbing example of an event 4 years out of step, cutting through what really was like a disguise.
We influence people. Sometimes we know it and discover it.
Exactly.
Most times we don't.
That's exactly the point. Boy, you never know.
Which is why we need to live in the knowledge the Lord sees us, and to the best of our ability be a good influence, not a bad one.
Character's what do you do when the lights are off, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's funny how those little incidents are so vivid, so many years later. I can still remember when we were passing into that street light.
So that would be 50 years ago now, and that memory to you is so vivid.
Yeah. 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 No, the decade slipped by.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. We had a sobering insight from because I just came back from the, second or third decade turnaround.
Yep.
And we went to the, I forget how to call it, sixth.
Was it the 60th?
60th, yeah.
Yeah.
60th, yeah, 60th. Anyway, it was disturbing.
60th reunion at the
Reunion.
Naval
Yeah.
Academy for listeners.
Yeah, exactly.
We're forgetting that we're sharing our time together
Yeah,
with
right.
others.
Yeah. So what was disturbing was to run into these old classmates, because it was so long that first it was hard to remember who's who. You go through some of that.
Yeah.
But it was also interesting to realize that most of them were totally adrift. They had retired from their 20 years or whatever in the service. They had played golf or whatever, and they were burnt out. You can just play so much golf. They were really adrift. How'd you do? What have you been doing? And they didn't have any answers. Virtually, with one exception I'm going to come to, they were, it was disturbing to realize how totally adrift and abandoned universally they felt, having gone through after retirement and then nothing to do kind of thing, except the Christians.
Mm.
It was interesting, the ones that were Christians, we had things to talk about and they were alive and because they had the Lord. But it was interesting, you could almost divide them into two categories, those that had the Lord and those that didn't. And it was really, Ron was with me, he had the same thing. It was just interesting to see how adrift some of them were that didn't have the Lord. They had nothing to really talk about. They didn't really have any replacement hobbies. They didn't have any, somehow, it was disturbing to realize how universally, because you're not talking about just a decade or two, you're talking several, see?
Yeah.
And really cut loose. And except the Christians, they had things to talk about, things they could share, things they...
Would some of those people would certainly have been career military that didn't just do 20 years, they did 30 years.
Yeah, still.
And their identity was wrapped up in that career to some degree.
But then
but they had nothing other than that.
It peters out.
Yeah.
You got on a committee or two with the Pentagon, but you run out of things to do. And the ones that have the most serious problems are the wives, because they have no identity.
Right.
The guys still have a little bit of identity because they're on a committee with the Pentagon or something.
Yep.
But women are no longer the admiral's wife or whatever. In fact, it's such a serious problem, and I know the Navy's even had some studies to figure out what to do, because most of the divorces occur after retirement.
Wow.
There was a very peculiar thing that bothered the Navy, that the divorce rate in the retired officers was a predictable problem. But because they're really kind of drift.
Yeah.
And but it's interesting, if they don't have the Lord, they have somehow the typical carryover sports don't work. How much golf can you play? You finally just... Interesting.
You chose not to do the career. You were going to go into business or out into the other world, and did.
Exactly. You did, yeah.
And I had a thought a while ago, but it has fled, concerning that when you came up with the little memory on the uniform dance thing.
Oh, I see.
There's so many things we've talked about over the many, many years, and that are fun but instructive in some ways for somebody following behind in
Sure.
life, and that influence that you have. You know, what would an older Chuck advise a younger Chuck? Really, you know, concerning family, you've really answered that concerning Nancy. How about, and you have to some degree in a career sense, find an advisor, make an advisor call.
I think advice calls are
Advice call.
very useful, if
Yeah.
you, especially in terms of planning a career, getting insights and so forth.
Right.
Contriving a way to get the advice of someone who's been there. And it's a simple idea, but it's got to be engineered a little bit to really make it work, you know.
Yeah.
And but the other thing, I guess, in terms of, you know, older guy advised younger, I think you grab opportunities. I think too often we tremble before imagined ills.
Take a chance.
Yeah, it's paying interest on a debt that never comes due. Right?
So let's go to the last thought that you had concerning the 60th reunion with a bunch of people, two groups.
I don't plan to go to the 70th. No, I
I'm
mean,
not even-
no, seriously. I mean, I thought about that.
Yeah?
Because I've been to several of them.
Yep.
And I know there's going to be a 70th, presumably.
Right.
I can't visualize even going, probably. It's just, it was a downer.
The question that I was going to get to is thinking of the other end of life, because you're way past retirement age.
Uh-huh.
And you haven't really retired. You're still active in you know.
No, I checked. The word retire doesn't occur in the Bible.
Yeah, well, you are retired. You've stepped aside. You're emeritus now, but in most things. But if a retired Chuck was going to talk to a imminent, you know, situation to a younger Chuck, what would you advise yourself? You've never really slowed down until recently.
No, I don't. I think you chase your passions, and your passion should be the coming king. I think if you're really focused on the coming king, all these other things take a whole different focus.
Yeah.
And I think that's without that they're meaningless.
Well, there is no focus.
Yeah.
Probably.
But with them, then that's the focus.
Yeah.
Is that Jesus is not a concept. He's alive, he's a living person with the destiny of taking over. And he's real. And part of that is to make that real in your life in terms of as a focus, as an involvement. And without that, the life is pretty vacuous and pretty empty, pretty meaningless. But with that, then everything takes focus. Everything has relevance. And suddenly you can measure good versus bad versus medium. You got a way of gauging things.
A point of reference.
Mm-hmm. So
Actually, the point of reference, singular article, probably.
yeah, and I think that's a plural in the sense it affects everything. You know, it affects everything. Yeah. And it should start with the partner you pick.
Pick them and stick with them. And pray they stick with you. Well, why don't we end there?
I think we've told them more than we know.
Yeah, well, and you end with a prayer, then I'll pray, and we'll ask everybody that watches to pray along with us. And again, I just encourage and ask everyone to pray for Chuck, for his health and his strength, and that he would continue to be a blessing to multitudes around the world. So why don't you go ahead?
Well, Father, we do thank you for who you are, and we thank you for your presence. Thank you for bringing us here right now. And we pray that your desire be fulfilled in all that we do, all that we are. That you would instruct us as how we can please you more. Guide us that we can make the most of the opportunities that you've presented before us as we commit ourselves into your hands in the name of Yeshua, our coming King.
And Lord, bless and strengthen and give insight and understanding of your word in new and fresh ways to Chuck, that he might then share them through speaking, writing, through our conversations with others. You've been such an encouragement over so many decades, and we just ask that you would keep him healthy and well, full of the joy of the Lord, free from any kind of sickness, illness, disease. Thank you that you've healed him over these last many months from grievous illness. And Lord, continue to bless him here, giving him rest and a quality of life that only you can give. So bless our friend, our mentor, and your child, Chuck Missler, we pray and ask. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you for watching once again, Tenses of Life, as Chuck and I sit here and really reminisce about the past, think about the goodness of the Lord in our lives, and keep praying, abide in the Word, and be blessed.
Amen. Never did. I mean, that was what I did for love. My profession had all kinds of commitments, but he was the one that really pinned that down, and he was probably the one that really nudged me, encouraged me to start thinking of myself as a Bible teacher. I never did. I just did it because I loved it, not because I was out some goal, you know.
Right.
And so, as I look back of all the people, I've had a lot of interesting people assist me, help me, and guide me. But it was really Hal that nurtured me into acting almost as the Lord's executive recruiter.
Okay. Well, it's interesting, you know, talking about your early influences to key men that passed along their passion, and you caught it. And then, you know, mentioning Hal makes me think of Walter. Walter Martin and Chuck Smith, and the way that you guys came together. Every week, pretty much, you were staying at Hal's house when you were doing after the Bible study, and the others you got up to mischief with, and it seems like you fed off each other, all of you.
Very much so. Oh yeah, absolutely. I've often felt that I had the benefit of being tutored by what I felt were the dominant personalities in the Christian community through those days. So yeah, absolutely. But there's another thing that we were talking about, things that were influential.
Yep.
There's another kind of thing that I was able to indulge in that's an unusual skill that I had the benefit of. It occurred to me as we were talking, I should probably bring this out as a possibility. There's a thing that we call an advice call.
An advice call.
An advice call. It's interesting. Probably all of us have somebody in our life on the horizon that are the major dominant leadership kinds of people that we don't know personally. But what's interesting, there's probably somebody you know in your family or nearby that does know them well. And I had the benefit more than once of taking advantage of that by someone that counseled me to do just that very thing.
To contact somebody else.
Yep, exactly.
And created the link for you.
And I had the opportunities to have what you'd call an advice call to Tex Thornton. Now, back in those days, there was the legend in the management literature was Charles Bates Thornton, who was known as Tex Thornton. He's the guy, 100 management experience, not too much. Go there for 5 years, no more, but you need that to really get a generalist thing. Well, it turned
knowledge
out,
base or whatever.
yeah, exactly. And it was about that time that the Ford Motor Company was getting Lee Iacocca and a guy by the name of Harley Coppers, who was one of their flamboyant executives. They were concerned about their lack of management depth. In General Motors, when there was an opening, which of 14 qualified guys would get the job? When Ford had an opening, the question, they were just too thin, they felt. So Lee Iacocca, they really had a passion to do something about deepening their management strength. And what Lee Iacocca came up with, he wanted to find a guy that's a generalist from a technology that's non-automotive to be the kind of guy they wanted to bring into their management team. And from that specification, someone remembered me from a previous employment at TRW years before. That's how Ford Motor Company came to approach me to come to Ford. And I had no real interest because I didn't want to go to Michigan. I was a California guy.
Yeah.
And I wasn't one of these guys that really had a big car interest. That wasn't my cut. But that was just the point, because I was in the perfect mindset to be spoiled rotten. They really made me offer I couldn't refuse. And it was through an advice call that caused me to recognize the value of that call, which I ultimately took, went to Ford for 5 years, and it was a huge experience for me to actually be in a private salary role in a company like the Ford Motor Company, which wasn't in my career plan, but it was actually the missing link to really broaden my own personal profile and fulfillment and the rest of it. And I've often thought that's a technique most of us wouldn't think of. We have to be taught the idea of engineering an advice call with the right kind of guy for whatever your situation is a powerful tool, because they're typically willing, under the right circumstances, to spend an hour with some
young up-and-comer or somebody who's interested enough to call them.
But what an impact that has to really get a one-on-one relevant assessment and suggested direction. And there's been more than one of those in my history, but that was the major one. I remember when I had the chance to sit down with Tex Thornton himself for an hour. That was a big deal. It occurred to me that's something that we don't know, that really invented the conglomerate, the high technology conglomerate. He's the guy, the founder of Litton Industries. There was about 10 guys that left the Air Force as a team that were experts in statistical control. Henry Ford had just taken over the company and realized they were in real trouble, had no controls. So he got 10 of these guys to come as a team, and they saved the company, the Ford Motor,
Ford Motor
Company. And in fact, I think 7 of the 10 later became the top leadership. Bob McNamara, J. Edward Lundy, R.J. Miller. These guys, they were they then themselves became legends. One of them left Ford after about 3 years, that acquired a little company and grew a thing called Litton Industries. He's known as the founder of Litton Industries, and he himself became a legend as Litton Industries, which was the granddaddy large-scale technology conglomerate, and he invented that whole idea. Well, it turned out I had a mutual friend that knew him and was able to arrange for him to receive me for what's called an advice call. I actually spent, I look back, for me it was an incredible experience to be able to sit down with him personally for a better part of an hour, just what we would call an advice call. He's glad to do it, and the advice I got from that changed my life. And it often occurred to me that that's a technique that's available to any of us if we take the trouble. All of us know somebody that of that caliber that we'd like to aspire to spend some time with.
Right.
And so Tex Thornton actually spent an hour with me, and out of all of that, I got counsel I've never forgotten. It really changed my whole perspective. I was an aerospace kind of guy, and he was the one that, because the path I was on was one that he could see the parallels, because he himself spent time in Ford, then Hughes Aircraft, and he created the high technology conglomerate out of that experience base. And he was the one that pointed out to me that I really needed to separate myself from my aerospace background, which is a narrow thing, to get some Fortune 500.
Well, hello and welcome once again to Tenses of Life here at the River Lodge in Reparoa, New Zealand with Dr. Chuck Missler and Brian Hughes. And we're just going to thank you to begin with for inviting us into your life, inviting us into your living room or space or wherever you might be watching this. And we were talking earlier today about what a wonderful blessing it is that people want to join us as we sit here and reminisce and talk about things past and present and future.
It's kind of a mystery. I mean, I'm just getting deluged with letters from people I don't know that are old friends. They know all they've tracked all the details, and I'm mystified by the intensity of their interest. But I'm flattered, of course, and it's nice to be able to respond. I haven't been able to keep up trying to personally respond to each letter. This is the best we can do, is just come back this way, I think, yeah.
Well, and part of being together with them in this format, sitting together and talking about things, and you being willing to open up your life and share things that are important to you and have been special over the last decades, I think is much appreciated, and the letters reflect that, really.
They sure do. It mystifies me, but I appreciate them, yeah.
Yeah. We've been, in the previous times we've sat together here in the Tenses of Life, we've been over what in your book format outline you call the prequel. Your young years, your early teen years. Right. And one of the highlights of that, clearly, as you've thought about it, is the two mentors who were primarily responsible for your love for the Word of God and your understanding of it.
William E. Biggs, he really invested in me we just developed a lot. He was like a big brother. We really did a lot of hobby things together, but he had a intrinsic passion for the Word, and that's contagious. Yeah. And and Ted Hacks. I had the benefit of a very unusual pastor. Ted Hacks was technically, I think you'd call him a Lutheran pastor, but he was really not really denominational. He really loved the Word. He had a passion for the Word itself. Went beyond any doctrinal boundaries, and that was also contagious. Those two really impacted my life in a way that I've never forgotten.
Well, and then we've talked a little bit about out of that grew your passion for the Word and your diligence in spending time in and with the Word, and how it became your primary hobby.
Yeah, I've always been very self-indulgent regarding hobbies. Photography and optics and all kinds of technical topics captured my attention, and I'd plunge into them, and I was able to, by a number of reasons, to really get into those hobbies. But of all those hobbies, the one that was the most dominant and most consistent all the way through, somewhere I just developed a deep love for the Word itself. Not as a religious thing, not as a ritualistic thing. No, it was just a fascinating area that was actually designed. Discovering those designs were a mystification. I just never outgrew that. And so as I lived through life, I always had a lot of hobbies. I was very self-indulgent in that regard. But my dominant hobby was just the Bible, for its own sake. I mean, it's hard to explain exactly. It wasn't from a religious kind of commitment. It was just, I just loved it. And I also recognized, I guess early, that you love your hobby more than you know your profession or your career.
Interesting.
You know, it's just a reality that's hard to admit.
Yeah.
But it's very true that you just that's where your passion really is, and so that endured through all my crazy projects and adventures. The theme that's all the way through there is a commitment to the Word, and not in a religious thing, not as if I had some goal set up. I just did because it was what I most enjoyed doing. And it was, in fact, Hal Lindsey. I was going through a dark time at one time, and he sat down with me and says, "Chuck, what do you like doing most?" And he knew what the answer was. He knew that it was Bible study. He says, "It ever occurred to you to make your hobby your profession?"